Welcome to the Global Addiction Therapeutics Innovation Day.
Are you ready for the last session? Last call? Ready for boarding? So my name is Yasser Kazal from Lausanne University and Montreal University. I'm very happy to be here for this Innovation Day and have the privilege to share this last session with Professor Alex Baldacchino from the St. Andrew University. And now I'm very pleased to welcome for the first talk Professor Supriya Munshaw from the Johns Hopkins School of Carey Business School. Supriya is professor and associated dean for academic program, and she developed the expertise in how to commercialize early product from science to technology and business. Welcome, Supriya.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Perfect. So first of all, thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful conference, our wonderful Global Innovation Day. It's been really fantastic sitting in the audience all day listening to what is going on in the addiction space and all the exciting new technologies that are on the forefront in innovation. So my name is Supriya Munshaw. I am Associate Professor of Practice at the Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. My background, so I have a PhD in computational biology focused on immunology, and hence you wonder why I am at a business school. But I was doing HIV research in my postdoc where we were characterizing antibody responses in long-term non-progressors. And at that time, when I was in graduate school, I didn't know why we were doing this. So when I asked my PI, why are we doing this? He said, well, we got to publish a paper, and we got to let them know about these antibodies. And I said, okay, but how are these antibodies going to help our patients or any patients? And there was just a disconnect between what we were doing and what I actually honestly did not understand what we were going to do with these antibodies. So anyway, that's where my journey started, with trying to understand how research from labs can actually get to market. And I started taking courses over at the business school and trying to understand how I can better bridge this gap between science and commercialization. Fast forward, I was at Johns Hopkins working in HCV research, and we had a patent for a vaccine strain for HCV, and then the business school at the time started teaching a course in commercialization of science. Essentially, we pair MBA students with researchers at Johns Hopkins, just like yourselves, and the MBA students learn how to, or they help the scientists figure out how their technologies can be commercialized. And that's where I started my career in the business school. That was 13 years ago. Still working with bridging science and business, still working with that program. I also work with many startups out of Johns Hopkins in trying to figure out the best pathway to get all these incredible technologies that are being developed, not only in the addiction space, but just all over into the market. My journey in the addiction space started a few years ago when we started a NIDA-sponsored program called the Innovations for Substance Use Disorder program. You'll see a little card that John, who is an alum of the program, handed out. But that's basically was the application of my experience in commercializing broadly science technologies into the addiction space. So I'm still very new in the addiction space, but I think over the last couple of years have learned a lot in the challenges that are specific to the addiction space. So the title of my talk is Bridging Innovation and Commercialization in Addiction Medicine, Strategies for Translating Research into Market-Ready Solutions. So as I said, and now the gap is closing, but there still exists quite an innovation commercialization gap. We all know that universities are the source of the most foundational addiction research. We've seen it all day today. That's where a lot of the really exciting research is coming out, whether it's neuroscience, whether it's treatment models, whether it's digital tools, therapeutics. But as I've seen, there are misaligned incentives in universities, right? Again, in my PhD research, the goal was to publish the paper, and that's how you get promoted, and there's a misalignment of what the university is seeking from researchers and how to get these into market. There's also commercialization skill gap, right? That's the gap that we're trying to fill with our program, as well as within Johns Hopkins, trying to just educate researchers on how it is that their technologies can move into the markets. And most importantly, really, is funding dead zones. So there's a huge valley of death between moving from research into market, right? You can apply for grants and move your research forward, and then there's a little bit of a dead zone that bridges the research grants to institutional funding like angels or venture capitalists, right? And the NIH, for example, has programs, commercialization programs such as the Small Business Innovation Research Grants, which are trying to bridge this gap. But there are only so many of those, and still there is a funding dead zone there, which reaches there. So what happens is that these amazing evidence-based solutions stay trapped in papers and pilot grants, right? While patients and providers struggle with outdated science or inaccessible care. So how do there are multiple aspects here, so how do we sort of bridge this gap and get more of these technologies out into the market? Addiction, like I said, my foray into addiction medicine is new, but what I've found is particularly challenging, and this is not news to all of you who are experts in addiction, right? Stigma is huge in addiction, which leads to very little venture capital funding in addiction science, right? There are no true and trusted business models out there where VCs will feel comfortable in funding addiction medicine. And part of the reason for this is that there are fragmented care systems. There's a lack of standardization in management and practices. There's enormous reimbursement complexity. And coming from the United States, where I don't think any country in the world has a more complex reimbursement system than the United States has, it's very, very challenging to get all the payers on board with trying to figure out how all these innovative technologies are going to pay for. The important thing is approval by FDA does not mean access. Many, many technologies are approved by FDA. They're efficacious, but they are not paid for by payers, leading to commercial failure, right? So this is very important in bridging that gap. There are constantly evolving policies. So there's always a new policy in Medicaid, Medicare, where most of our population lies. The social determinants of health makes this particularly challenging, and it makes it highly complex. We've heard the multiple comorbidities that also make it particularly challenging to innovate in this space. And then what I've found is there's asymmetrical innovation, which I talked about with a few people here, is that there's rapid innovation on the wrong side. The substances are innovating much faster at a much more rapid pace than we're able to innovate with technologies. So that's actually what, again, in my couple of years in addiction medicine has boggled my mind. How do we even keep up with the substances that are coming out year after year? So these are some specific challenges in the addiction space that you're all very familiar with. That doesn't mean we cannot innovate. We just have to keep in mind as we're innovating that these are going to be ahead of us, and we're taking these into consideration as we build solutions for our patients. So how do we innovate, right? Coming into from the science field, I have found often that researchers, and I'm very much guilty of this, right? We design the solution first. We have a solution, and then we go looking for the problem for the solution to fit into, right? This is where our first step first misstep is in innovation. I have this incredible medical device, and now I got to figure out how to use it, who actually will use it. And so innovations succeed when they address a valid, urgent, and well-defined problem for a very specific user, not just when they're scientifically novel. We're all capable of making extremely scientifically novel solutions. However, these solutions are solutions in search of a problem. And unless we start with the problem first, these solutions are going to have difficulty finding a place in the market, right? So designing the solution, then finding the problem is our first mistake. So our first strategy in trying to figure out how to design novel solutions or successful solutions, successful in the commercial marketplace, is to start with the problem, not with the solution. How do we do that? We need to define the problem that we're trying to solve very, very narrowly. What exactly are we trying to solve? Is it adherence to therapy? Is it relapse? What is the specific problem that we're solving? Then we need to validate with our stakeholders, and I'll talk a little bit about who these stakeholders are, and iterate over and over again before we design a complete solution. That is sort of the first step in innovation, is asking where the unmet need is, what that unmet need is, and how, with all the stakeholders' input, can we design a solution based on that unmet need. This is part of the program that we've developed, and we really focus in on, we spend time on really defining the problem that innovators are trying to solve. And it's interesting because people come into our program with a very specific, what they think is a very specific problem, and once we try to have them define it, they completely change and pivot what exact problem they're trying to solve, right? And so it's very, very, it's a great exercise for you to really sit down to figure out what exactly is your problem that you're solving. So you start with understanding unmet clinical needs, what's broken in the current addiction care system. Who are the users, right? We've heard today, many of you are clinicians, many of you are researchers. We've heard from patients, we've heard from, or you see patients on a day-to-day basis. We've heard from people with lived experience. Those are all incredible resources, but there are many more. There are case managers, there are courts, there's a criminal justice system. Who are your stakeholders and what are their needs? And then you can use structured tools to define the problem that you're trying to address. There are many different tools to do this sort of in a structured manner. If you're developing a drug product, you can use a target product profile or a TPP before you start developing. I've heard in our talks today that many are doing unmet need interviews, clinical journey mapping. Where is it? How does the patient go through the journey? Problem framing canvas, root cause analysis are some of the frameworks or tools you can use to really clarify that problem that you're trying to solve before you enter the solution. And you all have great solutions, but once you go back and redefine this problem, be open to pivoting your solution, because that is key to success, right? If you are stuck on your solution and don't have a clear understanding of the problem, then there is going to be an adoption issue and a potential commercial failure with this solution. So really, I would recommend, even when you do have a solution, to go back and use some of these tools to frame your problem. Once you have a problem and a population that you're solving the problem for, and an outcome, which is also important, and we'll talk about outcomes in a bit too, you can come up with a problem statement. And typically a problem statement is a way to address the problem that you've identified in the very specific population that you've also identified, that leads to a very specific outcome, which is measurable. And this outcome is not just measurable for the FDA or for a CE mark, but measurable to the payer, for example, because they're going to pay for your technology. So what are the outcomes that are most interesting to you? And we'll talk about keeping it simple. But an example here is a poor treatment adherence to people with substance use disorders. You can go narrow with that, narrower than that with increased retention and treatment, or reduced ER visits, or sustained sobriety. So very specific, measurable outcomes that you can then say that you're able to achieve with your solution. Strategy 2, engage stakeholders early, and I've talked about this or alluded to in many ways. We've already talked about with people with lived experience and clinicians, but really in not many talks today, and maybe I missed this, I heard the word payers, because I know at least in the United States, you cannot define or create a solution unless you have buy-in from the people who are going to pay for these solutions. It could be insurance, health insurance, it could be state-funded, it could be private pay, it could be patients that you're paying. If you're asking for patients to pay, then your population gets smaller, right? So it just depends on, as you're designing a solution, who is it that you're designing for, who is going to pay for the solution. Thinking about who is going to pay for the solution at the beginning of the innovation process will help you create an innovation that is more targeted towards what that payer is actually looking for. And what that payer may be looking for, again, is very different from what your patient is looking for, and from what your clinician is looking for, and from what regulatory agencies are looking for. So the payer must come very, very early in your engagement strategy. And this also is a place where many innovations will fail early on, is because there's no payer buy-in. Criminal justice system, if relevant, or behavioral health policymakers, public health officials. So this is just a non-comprehensive list of stakeholders, but you know who are the most important stakeholders for your innovation, and you have to engage them all to better understand what role they would play in there. It helps identify real-world constraints early, builds buy-in and trust from those who will adopt the innovation, surfaces insights that are missed in academic research. How would you do this? You can conduct structured stakeholder interviews, use advisory boards or focus groups, and then you can co-develop your value proposition and implementation plan with these stakeholders. So I'm going to move a little bit faster. I didn't think I had 20 minutes, but I'm going, I do. The third strategy that I want to talk about is demonstrating value early. And I've already alluded to this, right? You have to demonstrate value to each one of your stakeholders. And this value is different for every single stakeholder. While your patient might care about quality of life, your payer may care about reduced ER visits, and your clinician may care about whether this fits into their workflow, right? And so all of these values, each stakeholder will have a different value associated with your product, and if you don't take all of those into account, it will fall in the cracks once, right? Somewhere. So just taking clinicians, for example, many of you are clinicians here, right? At least today we've heard about a dozen apps potentially that are clinician recommended. Which one are you going to pick? Even within your mind, there are so many different options. For the patient, for example, we already are in app fatigue, right? So how many apps are we going to use? How are you going to demonstrate the value of your particular technology, your particular app, over all the ones that are out there, to the payer, to the clinician, to the provider, to the patient? Think like a payer, use simple models to quantify value, back up claims with early data. Here's some example from the website from Dynamicare, which is a digital recovery app. They've been doing a lot of pilot studies to measure payer outcomes and have had success in in designing very targeted studies for very targeted outcomes, and they've been successful with adoption using these pilot studies. So I would recommend you go on their website to see all the different types of outcomes that they are generating for their payers. Also de-risk the innovation, right? So you can de-risk the innovation by mapping regulatory and reimbursement pathways earlier, generating early evidence through non-dilutive funding. So I spoke a little bit about the NIDA grants of small business research grants. These types of grants can help you generate some early, the equivalent, I'm sure that there are equivalents in Europe too, but they can help you generate the early evidence, which is really valuable for later institutional funders like venture capitalists, right? So we always, one of my side jobs is investing in health technology companies as a VC, and we always look for such non-dilutive funding because they show credibility in the science to then be able to fund the research, fund further on. You want to build strategic partnerships and align with policy and funding trends. So an example here is Scene Health, which is a company that came out of Johns Hopkins, actually. They got SBIR funding for their DOT therapy, which is directly observed therapy for methadone treatment. They developed partnerships with Medicaid and health departments. They developed data package and had evidence generation, which then resulted in contracts with payers and public health systems. So they used their SBIR funding to generate some of the evidence that was required for follow-on contracts and grant funding. Lastly, we've talked about this already. Academic research is optimized for publication, not commercialization. So it requires training and translation, building infrastructure, changing the culture, and building bridges to successful innovation. So this really is going back to your academic institutions and asking for resources that help you bridge this gap between commercialization and research is very important. You can all be stewards of this initiative. I want to talk briefly, just quickly about our program, which is the Innovations for Substance Use Disorder program, which is, again, NIDA-funded, right? And this program, it does exactly that. It is for early-stage researchers at any stage in their career who are passionate about solving big challenges in the SUD space, right? And here we help academic scientists to define the problem that they're trying to solve, and we provide resources such as talking to payers, talking to persons with lived experience, and that could be the start of the journey for anybody who's trying to innovate. And lastly, the program starts in October and has an in-person component, but ends with a Carey Business School certificate, executive education certificate. And happy to answer any questions about this program that you may have. We have 3 alumni here in the audience as well. John Fitzgerald is right there, Dr. Adam, and I think Michael is somewhere. Oh, there he is, yes. So 3 alumni from the program, so catch them and ask them about the program as well. Yeah, I won't talk about it. I'm out of time, but happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. So you mentioned something very interesting about pivoting. So, but what if the advice we're getting is to pivot away from addiction completely? And the reason is because big pharma is not really getting interested into this. There are no clinical trial ongoing. The last 10 years, VCs are not investing in addiction whatsoever. So, like my company, we basically are working on a new drug for anti-withdrawal, opioid anti-withdrawal. But we're heading, straight into the death valley if we don't pivot.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, right? I think that there's just a lot of policy and funding issues in there. If there are so again, if you talk to stakeholders, talk to payers, and establish clear evidence that the payers want in order to be reimbursed for your technology, or your drug, and if there is if you're able to build partnerships in this area, I think that there would be funding. The gap in the funding is, to my knowledge, mainly because there's just unproven business models in this area. So nothing really works. you might have to look at outside the addiction space, things like depression or other mental health conditions where there has been a lot of innovation and adoption, and how you can potentially take those models and adopt into the addiction space. It's a little bit of a difficult market, but yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was great. My name is Thordís, and I have a mobile app that supports individuals with substance use disorder. So we already deployed our solution in Iceland, and like you mentioned, it's very important to define the problem first and then be able and be willing to reiterate if needed. Like you mentioned also, the business model can be challenging, especially for digital health, but specifically for addiction, since it's such a small market. Does your program also support the companies in actually finding funding or further like scaling into new markets?
Yeah, so the program is actually in collaboration with NIDA, and so the entire NIDA staff is typically there in the program, and they help so it's sort of like a training program to then apply for the gap, the Death Valley gap funding, and so that's how we promote the researchers to then be ready for some of these other grants that can bridge that gap between VC and funding.
That's awesome. Maybe one just follow-up question. Do you have companies that have actually managed to get through that have gone through your program?
So we've only had this program for 2 years. So and as you know, the innovation process is longer, but we have had people go through the program and have applied for SBIR grants or have applied for other translational funding, have gone on to pitch and win other competitions. So
awesome. Thank you so much.
Organized by International Society of Addiction Medicine, sponsors and co-organizers, Scenray, Indivir, Spark Biomedical, Salofa, Ethifarm, University of Minnesota, European Union Drugs Agency, UK Office for Life Sciences,